Wagwan. Today, another one from the gang relations series in GTA. This time we're entering a new level, cause we're leaving the 3D universe and enter a lot more complex world, the HD universe. The gang ecosystem is a lot more complicated in this world and paradoxically more subtle, which makes putting everything together a bit harder and a little speculative. But I've searched through everything useful on the subject this game contains I could think of, and I'll list all gang relationships and interactions I've managed to find in GTA 4, The Lost and Damned and The Ballad of Gay Tony, as well as describe as much as it's known for each one. Also, I've skipped certain beefs between small-time posses, especially if there was some uncertainty around them. I decided to focus mainly on the well-established gangs and rather avoid some small-time groups, even if they technically could be called gangs. That's because around those smaller ones, there usually weren't a lot to say about them. I've also skipped any gang wars that occurred during the gang wars side missions in TLAD, as I found them too inconsequential. Also, I sometimes skipped some indirect conflicts or minor unintentional conflicts, especially if they were already covered while discussing another gang relation, to not have to repeat myself too much. And that brings me to another thing. I'm sorry if some of the threads are going to be described multiple times, but that's for the people who only need to watch selected chapters, so they can still get all the info they need. However, I'll try to abstract each time a thread is repeated to make this watchable for everyone. And in some cases, instead of abstracting long threads, and in cases where one gang relation was fully described in another one, I've put those gang relations in parentheses in the chapter's name. Faustin's gang and Petrovic's gang. Faustin's gang was a Russian criminal organization operating in the Hove Beach area, led by Mikhail Faustin, who was closely assisted by Dmitry Rascalov. Petrovic's gang was also a Russian syndicate led by Kenny Petrovic. It was far larger than Faustin's gang. The LCPD database calls him the assumed kingpin of Russian organized crime all across the US. I weren't able to figure out the exact relationship between Petrovic and Faustin's crew prior to the event of the game, although the most likely scenario was that Petrovic seemingly allowed them to operate independently and didn't even demand a percentage. Not only that, but Lenny, his son, had even once participated in a cocaine exchange with Faustin's people. More than that, in one of the missions, Faustin ordered Nico to kill Lenny, fearing that he was a snitch. That means that Lenny must have known quite a lot about Mikhail's operation, which indicates that the two gangs even collaborated in some way. That partnership didn't seem to mean much to Mikhail Faustin though, and that's despite his gang not really being in a position to choose what they like. One time, Mikhail found out that someone was shipping TVs through his neighborhood. He had the shipment stolen with an intent to sell it, seemingly unknowingly that the people running it were under Petrovic's protection. Soon though, it became clear that even had Mikhail known that the people he'd robbed had been under Petrovic, he'd have probably still got it stolen. The news came to him that they are under close observation of the police. Even though his partner Dmitry suggested it was their fault and that they ought to keep a low profile for a while until the attention dies down, Faustin, not ready to admit his guilt, concluded that there must be a snitch within his organization. The main suspicion fell on Kenny Petrovic's son, Lenny, whom he soon had killed via his hitman. This was a declaration of war to Petrovic, and for a poor reason too. Considering the noise their gang had been recently making and that Lenny would have been dumb to choose to snitch, since being a son of a crime kingpin, he had far better opportunities, an idea that he might have been a snitch was completely irrational. Soon, Faustin didn't stop with his actions against Petrovic, this time indirectly again. There was a guy who owed him money. Faustin wanted to make an example out of him for not paying him in time and sent his hitman to explode a garage belonging to the guy. That person was also under Petrovic's protection. In the end, no war happened because Rascalov, who was heavily against Faustin's decisions, managed to explain everything to Petrovic, who demanded that in exchange for peace and Rascalov's and the hitman's lives, the hitman who killed his son must be the one to return the favor from him to Mr. Faustin. There is doubt surrounding the validity of that agreement, but we don't know for sure. Either way, the hitman, having little choice, believed it and assassinated Faustin, whose organization was taken over by Rascalov, and Petrovic was a man of his word. Therefore, no comebacks followed. It is very strange that one death of not that influential individual as Faustin was enough of a reason to let go of the death of his son, but that's another subject for another video, which I plan to make soon. Faustin's gang versus Lost MC. The Lost MC was an outlaw motorcycle gang based in Alderney, led throughout the entire story by Billy Gray and later Johnny Klebitz. Mikhail Faustin had a daughter, Anna, who he knew was dating one of the members of the Lost MC outlaw motorcycle gang, Jason Michaels. Faustin didn't think the bikers are a good scene, and since Anna refused to stop dating Jason, he had him killed. Despite the Lost swearing to avenge their dead soldier, no such action ever ensued. Badman's gang versus North Holland Hustlers. Badman's gang was a small-time Jamaican crew led by T4 Maxwell Davies, street name Real Badman. North Holland Hustlers weren't a specifically established gang, it was more of a collection of smaller African American factions operating mainly around the Holland district, though it is a term recognized by the LCPD. A few members of one of such factions once decided to expand their drug selling operation to a turf controlled by Badman's posse. That angered its boss, who had him killed. Rascalov's gang and Bulgarin's gang. Rascalov's gang is the same organization that once belonged to Mikhail Faustin, slightly rebranded after it had been taken over by Dmitry Rascalov following his former partner's death. Bulgarin's gang was another Russian syndicate led by Ray Bulgarin, mainly leading its operation in Russia as well as Eastern Europe. But in 2008, Bulgarin tried to expand its horizons in the United States. What made this organization even more dangerous and unpredictable was their leader, who valued money over everything, did not believe in any noble value and cared only about his own needs, was obsessed with revenge and was unable to admit his own guilt, which led to ridiculous campaigns. One of such happened in 2008 when he decided to hunt down a completely insignificant immigrant whom he'd wrongfully once blamed for losing his shipment back in Europe. The immigrant, Niko Bellic, turned out to be the same person as the one who'd killed Mikhail Faustin, allowing Rascalov to take over his gang. Rascalov decided to capitalize on this, and in order to impress his powerful friend Bulgarin, he gave Bellic up to him, whom Bulgarin unsuccessfully attempted to kill. This ridiculous quest for revenge didn't end there. Soon, Rascalov, still trying to help Bulgarin hunt down Bellic, burned down the business and flat of Bellic's cousin. Yet another time, some Russian loan sharks working for Rascalov kidnapped Bellic's cousin, whom they later used to lure Niko Bellic to a trap, from which he managed to get out alive after freeing his cousin. It is also worth noting that after Rascalov's death much later, Bulgarin claimed a big amount of heroin from his organization, and it was possibly also integrated into his gang entirely. Gerald McReary's crew versus Spanish Lords. Gerald McReary's crew was a small-time Irish gang led by Gerald McReary, who mostly performed robberies, aside from working muscle for the Alderney mob. The Spanish Lords was a Puerto Rican gang operating in many areas of Liberty City. Even though it was a big organization, the game didn't tell us much about them. One time, the McRearys wanted to buy merchandise off the Spanish Lords. It is unknown what exactly was meant to be the item of the transaction. However, considering that Elisabetta Torres, a Bohan-based Puerto Rican drug baroness, was supposed to help the McRearys sell the merchandise, it was more than likely drugs. In the end, it didn't matter what it was because the Lords ambushed the deal, wanting to steal the money off the McRearys. Thanks to Torres' backup, the McReary soldiers survived the setup. Gerald McReary's crew and Torres' gang. Torres' gang was a narcotics ring led by Elisabetta Torres, a Puerto Rican drug baroness in Bohan. Her business was about selling drugs, connecting buyers and sellers, as well as organizing protection for exchanges. In the story, she was in a business relationship with Gerald McReary's crew. The only time that partnership was highlighted in the story was the time when Elisabetta agreed to help the McRearys sell the stuff they were set to buy off the Spanish Lords gang. It was thanks to Elisabetta's backup that the representatives of the McRearys at the deal survived, as it was ambushed by the Lords. X's gang and Torres' gang. X's gang was mostly a drug trade oriented operation conducted by Trey Stewart, street name Playboy X. Previously, it had been started and led by Playboy's mentor, Dwayne Forge, who later had got himself locked up, and then X took over the operation completely in 2004. He was in a business relationship with Elizabeta Torres, who connected him with potential buyers/sellers for Playboy's merchandise, and in exchange, Playboy would sometimes run her a favor. One of those favors was when he took part in a heroin deal she helped set up for the Lost MC biker gang. The deal ultimately went south though, as the buyer turned out to be an undercover cop. Torres gang versus Spanish lords. In the mission Snowstorm, it turned out that the Spanish lords ripped off Elizabeta Torres off of cocaine. The members responsible for it soon paid for it with their lives after Elizabeta sent a hitman to retrieve the coke before they could sell it. Torres gang and Lost MC. This gang relation also includes Torres gang versus Angels of Death. One time, the Lost managed to get hold of a big load of heroin and wanted to sell it as soon as possible. Gray's contact, Elizabeta Torres, was the one who was supposed to help him find a buyer for their smack. She successfully did so, or at least that's what it looked like at first, because her contact turned out to be a Fed undercover. However, thanks to the protection she arranged for the deal, Kleebitz the biker managed to get out of there alive with his merchandise. Sometime later, when Kleebitz's club was in a poor financial situation, and overall a poor situation, she offered him work. The first task of Kleebitz and his companions was to, with the help of another befriended motorcycle gang, steal a shipment of cocaine conducted by the Angels of Death, who presumably had stolen the cocaine or something else of Torres previously. Although it's difficult to figure out exactly what the beef Elizabeta had with him was, since all she said was that they were thieves and snitches. Anyway, Johnny and the others pulled off the job and the drugs went back into Torres' hands. As the next thing, Johnny was asked by Elizabeta to collect her close friend at the airport, Marta, who was smuggling cocaine into the country from Puerto Rico, keeping her safe from the LCPD. And finally, Johnny also went to secure a drug deal for Elizabeta with some street dogs from Butterfly. The buyers got clever though, so the exchange didn't work out, but Johnny and the crew managed to return the stuff to Liz. The friendship between Johnny Kleebitz specifically and Torres was even mentioned in the first LCPD file. Lost MC and Angels of Death. Probably the most classic gang war in the game. The type we know from the previous games, especially GTA San Andreas, where two gangs just hate each other out of principle and because the culture developed that way. The Angels of Death were another motorcycle gang, sworn rivals to the Lost MC and led by Lester Arnold. The conflict between those two clubs started when Albert Lawson, a member of the AOD, had sex with one of the Lost's mothers an unspecified amount of time prior to the game event. However, considering that the rivalry was pretty strong by 2008, it must have been a longer period. The rivalry was built stronger when Billy Gray took charge of the club. The LCPD database notes that it was under his command that this conflict reached its peak. The events known to us included Gray chopping off some associated with the Angels girl's leg and leading to the nephew of who was presumably a member of the AOD falling into a coma, and the Angels then stealing Billy's bike. Soon, Gray got incarcerated and sentenced to rehabilitation after he committed a felony while under the influence of heroin. That was a turning point in this conflict because the current vice president, Johnny Kleebitz, took charge. Kleebitz was not a fan of beefing at a principal thing, and he decided to call a truce with the Angels of Death. It wasn't only a more practical choice, but the Lost were forced to it anyway, since the lawyers and rehabilitation fees they had to pay for Billy consumed a solid chunk of their budget, and it was much easier to do business without a war going on. Soon though, Gray got out and took back the reign over the club. The first day with Billy back out of the pen was also the last day of the truce between the Angels of Death and the Lost. Gray got angry that the Angels was still in possession of his bike, so he made his brothers, a term used by the bikers to refer to each other, to go get it back. In order to do that, they had to attack the Angels of course. That and the fact that Billy's bike was a part of the offering thanks to which the Angels had agreed for a truce meant that the war was back on. Firstly, the Angels wanted to explain the situation, so they came to the Lost clubhouse while they were having a party, which angered Billy again, who, assisted by the brothers, badmouthed and killed the Angels' messengers. Despite nobody being left alive to deliver this news back to the gang, the Angels knew very well that the good times were over. They quickly returned the favor to the Lost and jumped several groups of their members around town, which resulted in shootout and more deaths of both gangs' members. Then Gray got the info, possibly from the capo of the Ordini Mafia, Ray Bacino, though it was hard for me to establish what would have been the mafioso's motivation for that the Angels of Death had got in possession of a significant amount of heroin, which Gray planned to steal. With the help of the firepower provided by Bacino, the Lost went to the AOD clubhouse, assaulted it and successfully stole the H. The Angels were attacked again a few days afterwards when James Fitzgerald, the Lost's treasurer, found a buyer for certain motorcycle models in possession of which were currently the Angels. Therefore, him and Johnny robbed one of the Angels' hangouts and stole the bikes. The war didn't escalate too much. Soon, Billy Gray got himself banged up again, this time for a lot of time. Fitzgerald, in order to make sure that they deal with the Angels before they can deal with them while they're in shambles, because Billy's death sparked a civil war within the Lost, bought explosives with whose help Klebitz destroyed a few of Angels of Death's shipments, dealing them a severe blow which later saw a severe decrease in violent activity between the two organizations. Though that decrease didn't reach zero, sometime later, Klebitz hit the AOD's cocaine shipment they had presumably stolen from Elizabeta Torres, of which he'd been asked by Liz herself actually. Badman's gang and Torres' gang. It seems as if the crew of real Badman was collaborating sometimes with Elizabeta Torres. First, after Nico begins working for Lizzie, Jacob will call him, warning him to not get on the wrong side of her, but saying that he knows her and that she's okay. In the mission The Snowstorm, we find out that Elizabeta got a hookup from Jacob Hughes, Badman's right-hand man, who ended up stealing Liz's snow, and additionally she suspected they brought the police attention to her. This led to a little dispute between Jacob and Elizabeta, and we don't know of any further collaborations between those two gangs until Elizabeta's imprisonment. Spanish Lords and Angels of Death. In the mission The Snowstorm, the Spanish Lords who had robbed Elizabeta Torres of her cocaine wanted to sell it to the Angels of Death in the abandoned hospital on Colony Island. The deal didn't happen as Torres' man ambushed both parties and escaped with the coke. The Commission. Before we get to the gang relations involving the Italian mafia, it's worth explaining what the Commission was. The Commission was a committee to which 5 Liberty City Italian mafia families belonged, who collaborated in order to make sure there's no or as few conflicts as possible between the Italian organizations in town, and not only, as well as they were supposed to intervene whenever one occurred. The 5 of the strongest Liberty City families who had a seat on the commission in 2008 were the Gambetti Crime Syndicate, led by John Gravelli, the Pavano Crime Syndicate, led by Mary Valvona, the Messina Crime Syndicate, led by Harvey Noto, the Lupisella Crime Syndicate, whose leader was de jure Mark Lupisella, de facto Vincent Lupisella, and the Ancelotti Crime Syndicate, led by Giovanni Ancelotti. Gerald McReary's crew and Pegorino Crime Syndicate. This gang relation also includes Gerald McReary's crew versus Ancelotti Crime Syndicate, Ancelotti Crime Syndicate and Albanian gang, Pegorino Crime Syndicate versus Albanian mob, and Gerald McReary's crew and Bulgarin's gang. The Pegorino Crime Syndicate, also known as the Ordini mob, was the weakest Italian mafia family in the game. As one of its names suggested, it operated prominently in Ordini, though not exclusively, as for example one of their capos owned a restaurant in Little Italy in Algonquin. Its leader was James Pegorino, whose main objective was to get his organization a seat in the commission. The McRearys were Pegorino's muscle. The first story instance of this collaboration was when a capo of the Pegorinos, Ray Bacino, gave the McRearys intel about a Triad shipment of medications due to arrive in town. Patrick McReary, along with his friend Nico Bellic, robbed the shipment of the Chinese for Bacino. Sometime later, Bacino delivered another piece of news to the McRearys, informing them that the Ancelotti-run waste management plant had recently earned a lot of money, so the McRearys were sent to steal it. The operation was again run by Patrick McReary, assisted by Nico Bellic and another 2 of his friends. The McRearys also played a big role in Pegorino's later plan, which aimed at weakening the at the time weakest in the commission mafia family, the Ancelottis, so they could take their place in the commission. The McReary's soon tricked the Ancelottis into thinking that the Albanians, whom they were using as muscle similarly to how the Pegorinos used McReary's, had a hit at him. McReary's hitman planted a bomb to Anthony Spoleto's car, an Ancelotti's member responsible for managing the alliance with the Albanians, right after he went to meet the Albanians, and then later exploded it once he arrived to meet with some of his colleagues, who were all killed in the end by Gerald's hitman, suggesting to the rest of the gang that the Albanians must have been behind everything. Next, another action aiming at sabotaging this alliance was to take place. This time, Gerald sent Nico Bellic, the friend of his brother Patrick, to kill Frankie Garone, an Ancelotti long-serving capo, with Nico disguised as an Albanian. The plan to weaken the Ancelottis was going well so far, and now Pegorino wanted to pull off something heavier. He told the McReary's to kidnap the daughter of the Don of the syndicate, Giovanni Ancelotti, Grace, who soon was sitting locked up in the McReary's den with a gag in her mouth. The problem arose when the Ancelottis managed to find out where the McReary's kept Gracie, and they tried to rescue her while she was being moved to another location by Bellic, failing to do so ultimately. At the end, it seemed like the Pegorinos managed to find out that the diamonds Bacino had tried to sell got into the hands of the Ancelottis, therefore they asked the McReary's to exchange them for Grace. The deal was arranged, but the McReary's didn't get the diamonds, though it wasn't the Ancelotti's messengers who were the problem. Bulgarin with his gang appeared on the scene, and one of their goons, while he was cornered, threw the diamonds onto a bypassing dust cart, which drove them away out of the McReary's reach. The plan to weaken the Ancelottis didn't end there, but that was the end of the McReary family's involvement, at least the one we would know about. Gerald McReary's crew versus Triad. In the mission harboring a grudge, the McReary's were asked by the Pegorino's capo Ray Bacino to steal the shipment of medications the Chinese Triad was bringing into town in the harbor. The action went successfully, leaving many gang members dead and the medications in the hands of Bacino. Pegorino Crime Syndicate versus Triad. Ray Bacino, a capo of the Pegorinos, one time got intel about the Chinese Triad bringing in a shipment of medications into Liberty City. He decided to have the shipment stolen using the boys from the McReary's crew. Much later, Phil Bell, Pegorino's lieutenant, decided to steal the heroin the Triads had got hold of and wanted to offload it as soon as could be, which was carried out by Nico Bellic, who'd got recruited to direct work for the Pegorinos after he'd impressed Ray while working for the McReary's. Pegorino Crime Syndicate versus Ancelotti Crime Syndicate. This one is probably the most elaborate and interesting gang relation in this entire game. The first instance of this conflict was when Ray Bacino, a capo of the Pegorinos, asked the McReary's, the gang they used as muscle, to rob the Ancelotti's waste management depot after he'd heard they'd got a big paycheck recently. Soon, the Pegorinos, who were the weakest family in the game, wanted to get a seat on the commission by weakening the weakest family in the commission, the Ancelotti's. As a matter of it, they first stirred up a conflict between the Ancelottis and their muscle, the Albanian gang, using their own muscle, so the McReary's, by killing Anthony Spoleto and then Frankie Garone, two important members of the Ancelottis, both times making it so the blame would fall on the Albanians. Sometime later, Ray Bacino also found out about the Ancelottis trying to buy diamonds for $2 million and used the bikers from the Lost MC gang to disturb the exchange and steal the ice. Though that wasn't done as a part of the operation aiming to weaken the Ancelottis in order to replace them in the commission. The ice thievery was purely Bacino's side business. The Anchis attempted to steal the ice back while Ray's people were picking it up from the rubbish around Algonquin, which was Ray's plan to keep the operation inconspicuous, but they failed. Returning to the plan though, the next step became kidnapping the Don Ancelotti's daughter Grace, which was carried out by the McReary's. Sometime after that, we could find out that the McReary's actions aiming at creating a dispute between the Ancelottis and the Albanians had worked, and now the Ancelottis had started to buy cocaine from a certain Russian gang. The Pegorinos got a drop about one of the shipments coming in by boat and managed to steal the truck the Ancelottis were supposed to take to collect the seed. Bell, with the help of Bellic, used the truck to pretend that they were the Ancelottis. The plan didn't work, as expected by the both of them, so they ended up killing everyone at the place and stealing the snow the traditional way. Then somehow Charlie Matteo, a top capo of the Ancelotti, found out that it was James Pegorino crew behind ripping off the Ancelottis by stealing that cocaine. He was planning to take a helicopter into Algonquin in order to tell the commission about it. As you remember, the commission was supposed to supervise the relations between the Italian organizations. If they found out that the Pegorinos were sabotaging the Ancelottis in order to replace them in the commission, they would be in a lot of trouble. That's why Bell made Nico Bellic kill Matteo before he could take off to Algonquin, which he managed to do. Soon after that, the Pegorinos found out that the diamonds Ray had stolen and which he'd later lost were back in the hands of the people he'd stolen them from in the first place. And those people, namely Tony Prince's lot, were in league with the Ancelottis, whose Don's daughter, the McRearys, still kept hostage. Thus, they thought that those diamonds would do as a good price for giving Grace back to her daddy. The deal was arranged and the Ancelottis did get Gracie and gave up the ice. However, that was quickly lost due to an unexpected assault of Ray Bulgarin's people. That fiasco ended the Pegorinos' efforts to knock the Ancelottis off their seat on the commission. However, not entirely. See, at the end of the story, as a part of the deal storyline, the Pegorinos want to offload the H they had stolen from the Triad to the Rascalov's gang, who had a buyer for it. The buyers at the docks have the skins listed in the files as mafia, and we remember that Rascalov's people were dealing with the Ancelottis. Therefore, it's very likely that Dimitri's buyers for the Pegorino smack were the Ancelottis, which would be pretty funny if that's true. After all, the Pegorinos had been trying to weaken the Ancelottis for the last weeks in order to replace them in the commission. And as their final step to do that, they sold the Ancelottis the heroin without being aware of it that it's the Ancelottis who they're selling to. Anyway, Rascalov changed his mind and decided to keep the heroin for themselves rather than giving it to the Ancelottis. That's why Bell and Bellic had to steal the money from them by force, which turned the funny situation I described a moment ago into, well, it's still funny they didn't know they were selling to the Ancelottis, but they were lucky enough that Dimitri had decided to set him up, and so they ended up getting the money for the H, killing a bunch of Ancelotti soldiers and leaving them with no money and no merchandise. Gerald McReary's crew versus Albanian gang. The Albanian gang were a gang we didn't know too much about really. In contrast to what one may read on the GTA wiki, the Albanian loan sharks Roman Bellic had owed money to at the beginning of the story were in no way connected to the Albanian gang, and definitely weren't high-ranking members of it. That could be concluded from the fact that the LCPD database describes them as small-time Albanian hoods, as well as the fact that even Roman wasn't scared to kill them. So no, the loan sharks from the beginning of the plot didn't probably have much to do with the main Albanian gang we're talking about now. What we do know about the Albanians is that the Ancelotti mafia used them as muscle. In 2008, the Pegorinos successfully sabotaged the alliance using the McRearys by tricking the Ancelottis that the Albanians had killed their two important members. The Albanians eventually realized that it was the McRearys who had ruined their alliance with the Anchis and decided to take revenge. First though, unclear whether a part of the vendetta on the McRearys, they attempted to spoil Kim Young-guk's arrival at the city, which was supervised by Derek McReary, failing to do so in the end. Then they seem to have been inspired by the Ballers because they attacked the McReary family during a funeral of one of Gerald's brothers, though all it brought them was casualties and embarrassment. Pegorino Crime Syndicate and Northwood Dominican drug dealers. Northwood Dominican drug dealers were a small Dominican gang led by Willie Valerio. One of its members, though not stated explicitly yet heavily suggested, was Teddy Benavides, who was operating at Alderney and was under the protection from the Pegorino Crime Syndicate, specifically its capo, Ray Bacino. By 2008, Benavides didn't consider the Pegorinos strong enough for him to be paying for their protection anymore, so he stopped. That angered Bacino, who had him killed. Pegorino Crime Syndicate and Lost MC. In the mission Action/Reaction, we find out that the Lost were buying weaponry off Ray Bacino, a capo of the Pegorinos. Bacino in that mission also tipped off Billy Gray, the Lost's leader, about a big chunk of heroin their sworn rivals the Angels of Death got in possession of, which info the Lost utilized to steal it. Next time this alliance comes about is when Ray Pacino revealed to Johnny and his crew the location of Brian, the Lost secretary who organized the rebellion against Johnny in the Lost after Gray had got incarcerated again, and asked them to end their internal dispute because it's bad for business. That's exactly what the bikers soon done. Sometime after that, Pacino offered Johnny a business deal. He was supposed to steal the diamonds from the exchanger in which they were to be sold to the Ancelotti's messengers. Johnny, along with his brothers, pulled it off and stashed the ice in the rubbish, which was part of Ray's plan. Soon, Klebitz of the Lost also was involved by Ray in selling the ice to the Jewish diamond dealers at the Libertonian Museum. The exchange was spoiled by an assassin whom no one at the meeting could identify and who stole the diamonds. That wasn't a problem for Johnny though, who managed to get hold of the cash the Jewish dealers brought to pay for the diamonds. He got rid of Pacino's backup, which arrived at the museum, did not return the money to Ray, yet told him that he didn't know where it was. Ray did not let Klebitz make a fool of him and soon had him and his associate James Fitzgerald kidnapped and tortured him in his restaurant's basement to make him tell him where the money was. The two bikers didn't fold and managed to get out of there alive, additionally killing one of Ray's men in the process. Pacino sent his goons after both of them, who failed to kill Johnny but managed to kill Fitzgerald. Though we don't really know what happened to the money, but if to believe the dialogue in the No Way on the Subway mission, it was possibly retrieved by the Pegorinos. Though if to consider that every one of the Pegorinos was angry at Ray after all, the money was most likely never regained. Either way, the conflict didn't continue any longer, as Ray soon became busy with the feds on his case and killed soon after at the orders of his own boss. Gerald McReary's crew and North Korean gang. The chapter also includes North Korean gang versus Albanian gang. The North Korean gang was a gang we don't know much about, but we know they owned a Chinese restaurant in Alderney by the name of Mr. Fook's Rice Box. One of its associates was Kim Young-guk, who arrived to Liberty City from North Korea with so-called super dollars, very good counterfeits of the US dollars, which was a part of the counterfeiting operation conducted by the government of North Korea. It seemed that the North Korean gang was serving as protection for Young-guk in Liberty City. His arrival into town was supervised by Derek McReary of Gerald McReary's crew with the assistance of his family's friend Nico Bellic, who managed to stop Albanian thugs from ambushing his arrival. Gerald McReary's crew versus an unnamed mafia. This one is more of a cool fun fact many may have skipped. Derek McReary, who in 2008 returned to Liberty City after spending a long time in Ireland, was revealed by his Fed brother Francis McReary in the Blood Brothers mission to have left Liberty City for Ireland before the years after he'd been caught stealing from the mafia, though he didn't say which family or any background of that robbery.
He only left here in the first place because he was caught stealing from the mafia.
Pegorino Crime Syndicate versus Pavano Crime Syndicate. As we said in previous chapters, the Pegorinos wanted to weaken the Ancelottis to get their seat on the commission. However, James Pegorino didn't only thought of that, but he also knew that once the Ancelottis are dealt with, they'll still need some support amongst the remaining families on the commission, at least one of them, in order to get the seat. That's why he tried to play friends with the Pavanos, whom he'd allowed to operate on his turf up to this point. He wanted to give them a little gift, and in exchange he hoped that the Pavanos would back him once the Anchis are out of the picture and the time would come to pick a family to replace them in the commission. Therefore, he organized a meeting with them on an abandoned site in the south of Alderney. The Pavanos didn't accept Peg's offering and wanted to steal the gift he'd given him and kill him and his bodyguards. They managed to kill two of his boys, one James himself, who was eventually saved by his third bodyguard, who also managed to recover Pegorino's offering. Soon, James Pegorino sent that third bodyguard to follow a couple of Pavano's members who were heading to a meet with their colleagues to a car showroom in Alderney to collect a piece of earnings from the bookie ring controlled by the family. Once Bellic, the third bodyguard, arrived, he killed all the gangsters in the showroom and stole the money they were going to collect. No further action was taken by neither side in this conflict. Ancelotti Crime Syndicate and the Rascalov's gang. At some point during the story, the Ancelottis began to buy cocaine off a Russian gang who were importing it from Vice City. It isn't said in the game explicitly that that gang was Rascalov's people, however considering that in this mission it's said that the Anchis are working with Russians, and then in the end of the story we find out that Rascalov's buyer for Pegorino heroin was a mafia family, it's logical that it was the same alliance. The alliance between Rascalov and the Ancelottis was also mentioned during the John Gravelli's thread. Though still, just wanna say that this is my assumption based on strong suggestion, but still not 100% confirmed. In any case, this partnership was a very tough one. First, one of the shipments got stolen off the Russians by the Pegorino mafia before the Anchis could collect it. Later, when one of the Ancelotti capos, Charlie Matteo, found out that it was the Pegorinos behind the robbery, the Russians protected him at the abandoned Sprunk factory as he was being chased by a Pegorino's hitman who wanted to kill him before he can squeal to the commission that the Pegorinos were sabotaging their business, ultimately failing to protect Matteo, who got capped by the hitman. Also later, another shipment of cocaine that the Russians kept for the Ancelottis was destroyed by Bellic at the orders of the Gambetti's Don. And then at the end of the story, when the Pegorinos were selling smack to the Ancelottis via Rascalov, he decided to take the heroin for himself, forcing the Pegorinos to steal the money from the Ancelottis by force. The Ancelottis were another example to anyone who even thought about working with that snake Dimitri. Pegorino Crime Syndicate versus Rascalov's gang. The conflict started when the Pegorinos found out about the Russians bringing in the shipment of snow for the Ancelottis and decided to steal it before the Anchis could get their hands on it. Then another clash ensued when the Pegorinos sent a hitman to an abandoned Sprunk factory to kill Charlie Matteo, an Ancelotti capo, before he could squeal to the commission about Pegorinos mashing up their action. Then Russians, presumably Rascalov's people, were protecting Matteo, ultimately not managing to. Soon, Rascalov decided to make an offer to the Pegorinos. He had a buyer for the heroin, so he wanted to act as a mediator, presumably in exchange for a portion of the deal. The Pegorinos, most likely unaware that the Russian gangsters the Ancelottis were dealing with were Rascalov's guys, or simply because they weren't, because this section is speculative, agreed to do so the H via the Russians. This turned out to be a mistake. Not only Rascalov eventually didn't pass on the cocaine to the buyers, forcing Pegorino's people to kill them in order to get paid for the smack, but then later Rascalov personally killed James Pegorino as he didn't want to continue the relationship. It isn't clear to me what Rascalov's business was in getting rid of the Peg. After all, he got the heroin and the Pegorinos got the money. There was talk about a further relationship, though it'd be weird for Pegorino to want to work with a guy who set him up on their first date. And even if there was one, it would have barely just begun, therefore not enough time for it to generate any profit yet which Dimitri could rob of Pegorino. It seems more as if Dimitri simply went to where Pegorino was hiding at and killed him just for fun, as we know he liked to do. Though he did say that he didn't work that hard to share the spoils of victory.
I didn't work this hard to share the spoils of a victory!
So I don't really get it. You've been given heroin for money, what's there to share? Unless he wanted to steal the money from the deal back. That seems to be the most plausible possibility. X's gang versus Messina Crime Syndicate. There was this real estate developer, Yusuf Amir, a boy making an impression of a man spoiled by his mega millionaire Arab sheikh daddy. Still, he was building some big ass building in LC in 2008, though the construction ran into some trouble. A transport union shut down his site and deployed armed men to guard the place and not to allow workers to continue their work. In the ballad, we found out that the union was basically one of the front of the Messina mafia family, so it can be concluded that the Messinas simply wanted to extort money from Amir, maybe because they'd found that Amir's project was breaking a few micro rules or something like that. Or they were racist, as was brilliantly theorized by Playboy, although who knows. Actually, the motivation for that indeed could have had xenophobic roots, as in the game the Messinas at the site have dialogue lines which clearly indicate that they are not happy that immigrants were taking the jobs instead of Americans.
We're gonna fight to keep these jobs in American hands! Stupid immigrants! You're trying to take Americans!
You ain't bringing in no immigrant scabs.
Anyway, Playboy X was interested in that whole affair because he also had aspirations to become a real estate developer, and he considered linking up with Amir as his ladder to realizing these ambitions. But he knew he had to impress him first. That's why he hired Bellic to clear his construction site from all the Messina's goons guarding it. He reckoned that this would eliminate the problem and that Yusuf would be grateful to him, and in exchange would introduce Playboy to the world of estate development. The construction site soon was turned into a graveyard. Though the other part of the plan didn't quite work out, Amir shut down the site in honor to all those who've fallen there. X's gang and the North Holland Hustlers. Now in this one, I need to talk about the North Holland Hustlers a bit more. I find it difficult to determine the exact structure, nature and affiliations of this organization. It's described in the LCPD database similarly to how other gangs is. However, it seems more to me like a loose collective of African American gangsters operating around the North Holland, East Holland and Northwood areas. We do have gangsters spawning in the streets, and the exact same skins have the members of Clarence Little's crew from the Holland Knights mission. The same ones have the bodyguards of Playboy X, even though in the LCPD files of neither Dwayne, Forge nor Playboy is it stated that they belong to the gang. Also, Javan was the member of the NHH, and he was killed at the orders of Dwayne Forge in the story after he'd realized he'd squealed on him to the feds and that it was because of him that he got incarcerated. And here comes the fourth example, the photo shoot mission. Playboy said to Nico that one of the guys he know had been talking shit about him and that he is snitch, and wanted Nico to kill him. What I'm trying to say is that X's gang could or could not be a part of the NHH, and even if they were, this gang never was a truly united organization. They were more of a loose collective of smaller criminal groups from that area who were often clashing, didn't probably pay to no bosses, etc. Therefore, this gang relation is somewhat arguable, as it could have simply been something along the lines of an internal dispute with someone who was your contact but probably nothing more, if you know what I mean. Gambetti Crime Syndicate versus Rascalov's gang. This chapter also includes Gambetti Crime Syndicate versus Ancelotti Crime Syndicate. In 2008, Rascalov's gang tried to take control of the protection rackets that had up to that point been controlled by the Gambetti mafia family. In order to stop that using someone else's resources, John Gravelli, the don of the Gambettis, got his friend Bobby Henderson to give a speech at the City Hall which would inform about the new threat in Liberty City in the shape of Russian organized crime. That speech was supposed to force the mayor to increase the efforts and focus the resources on getting rid of the Russian criminals. Henderson was attacked on his way to the hall, but thanks to Gambetti's hitman, he got to the place in one piece and gave the speech which achieved the expected effect. Then a bit later, Gambetti was told that Rascalov was also supplying the Anchis with cocaine and had Bellic destroyed their cocaine. Gambetti Crime Syndicate versus North Korean gang. When John Gravelli found out that Kim Young-guk, a North Korean man, arrived in the city with counterfeit American money, he immediately wanted to have this problem dealt with, as him selling fake American money devalued the American currency, which was bad for his business of course.
And he also done it as a favor for the ULP contact.
He sent Nico Bellic to assassinate Young-guk, which Bellic achieved after shooting his way through a Chinese restaurant which was a front of the North Korean gang. X's gang and Spanish lords. In the mission Undressed to Kill, Forge asked Nico to kill 3 brothers who ran the strip club in Bohan. These men were members of the Spanish lords, and we were informed in the game that before their death they used to do business with Playboy X.
Triad and the Angels of Death. Sorry for the voice in this chapter, but I've been sick and I have to re-record this section during the edit because I realized I wrote complete nonsense in the script. The Angels seem to be a gang operating under the Triad supervision, but their general alliance was mentioned in the LCPD file of Hisin Jiaoming, so the Triad's leader. In 2008, the Triads brought a big shipment of heroin into Liberty City and they gave it to the Angels, who were most likely meant to sell it. The Brown was robbed of the Angels by the Lost though, which angered the Triads, who killed a few of their members as a punishment.
Triad versus Korean gangs. In the same file, it is also said that Xiaoming's Triad collaborated with several Korean gangs, which included Midtown gangsters and possibly the North Korean gang Kim Young-guk belonged to, or perhaps these two is the same organization. Triad and Lost MC. Billy Gray, the president of the motorcycle club Lost MC, was angry at his right-hand man Johnny Klebitz. He noticed that Klebitz ever more often criticized his decisions and questioned his leadership. Angry for the disrespect and concerned for his position, he made a deal with the Chinese Triad, who was looking to retrieve their drugs, of which possession the Lost were currently in. They organized an ambush. Gray was supposed to send Klebitz to sell the heroin back to the Chinese, during which exchange the Triads at the deal were supposed to cap him. This eventually failed, as the Triads missed their shot and Klebitz managed to escape after shooting his way through an army of pissed off Asians. Lost MC and Uptown Riders. This chapter also includes Torres Gang and Uptown Riders vs Angels of Death. The Uptown Riders were a modern motorcycle gang based out of Northwood. After Billy Gray got incarcerated for a second time, James Fitzgerald, the treasurer of the Lost, reached out to two of its members, Malk and Deshawn, off whom he bought pipe bombs.
A small correction again, he didn't buy them directly from Malk and Deshawn, they just hooked him up with their contact who could sell him pipe bombs.
The paths of the clubs crossed again while both Malk and Deshawn and Johnny Klebitz were working for Elizabeth Torres. For her, they stole a coke shipment of the Angels of Death as well as attended a drug exchange together. Then sometime later, Malk helped Klebitz in kidnapping Roman Bellic for Russian loan sharks led by Dmitry Rascalov as a matter of paying a debtor Johnny's ex off. Ancelotti Crime Syndicate and Triad. In the Ballad of Gay Tony, we find out that the Ancelotti Mafia were in an alliance with the Triad. One time, the Triad asked Rocco Pelosi, a capo of the Anchis, to resolve a licensing issue for the club they was planning to open. Pelosi failed to deliver though, as he hooked the Chinese up with people who had no competence of solving such issues, which ended in a bloody shootout in which many members of the Triad fell dead, for which the Triads were long after angry at the Anchis for. Ancelotti Crime Syndicate vs Messina Crime Syndicate. There seemed to be a rivalry between the Ancelottis and the Messinas. The Anchis were specifically unhappy with the influence the Messinas had on the transport union in town. They first somewhat brutally interrogated one of the union officials who revealed the Messinas' involvement, and later Pelosi got one of his debtors to kill 3 people that had something to do with the union, presumably the ones that were bribed by the Messina family in order to put an end to their involvement. Ancelotti Crime Syndicate and Bulgarin's gang. The diamonds, whose ownership Ray Bulgarin claimed, eventually found themselves in the hands of the Ancelotti family, who then planned to exchange them for the kidnapped daughter of the Don Ancelotti. Right after the exchange, Ray Bulgarin arrived at the scene with his people to get the diamonds and kill Ancelotti's daughter, although for no sensible reason, unless it was a part of his revenge for stealing the ice from him. Grace managed to escape though, which later saw Bulgarin coming to talk to the Don Ancelotti personally, demanding blood for the fact that his organization was involved in the affair of the stolen diamonds that apparently belonged to him. Therefore, Rocco Pelosi, a capo of the Anchis, made up a plan to kill Tony Prince, who bought the ice for him in order to satisfy Bulgarin's bloodlust. The plan ultimately failed, as Prince's bodyguard, who was supposed to kill him, resigned in the last moment. Bulgarin didn't do any further damage to the Ancelottis after this, as he died at the hands of the same bodyguard before he could do anything. Pavano Crime Syndicate and the North Holland Hustlers. In the LCPD file for Joe Corolla, a guy responsible for heroin distribution in the Pavano mafia family, it is suggested that the Pavanos might have been selling heroin to the North Holland Hustlers gang. Messina Crime Syndicate and Gambetti Crime Syndicate. In the LCPD file for Harvey Noto, the head of the Messinas, it is said he is a close friend to John Gravelli, the Don of the Gambettis. However, it was also said that this is despite rivalries, which means that the relationship between those two gangs were not ideal. Gambetti Crime Syndicate vs Pavano Crime Syndicate and Ancelotti Crime Syndicate vs Lupisella Crime Syndicate. In one of the news articles, the reporter mentioned 2 Italian beefs that used to take place back in the day. Those are the Gambettis versus the Pavanos and the Ancelottis versus the Lupisellas. No further details on them were given, and this is the only known gang relation of the Lupisella mafia family apart from the commission, to which in fact it is said nowhere they belonged. It is only assumed so because we got 6 mafia families in the game, with one of them surely not on the commission, namely the Pegorinos. And since the real life commission is formed by 5 NY mafia families, it was assumed that all the mafia families mentioned in the game apart from the Pegorinos have a seat on the commission. Northwood Dominican drug dealers versus North Holland Hustlers. In the LCPD file for Willie Valero, it is stated that the Dominicans tried to compete with the NHH, though unsuccessfully due to not being able to push enough product. And that's it for today. I really didn't expect this video to be so complex, but I think that if any game needed its gang relations explained more, it was GTA 4, because here they are way subtler than in the 3D games. Like the video if you found it entertaining or educational, and leave a comment with your thoughts or if you got any questions. I thank you for watching till the end. Respect.